Hey, hello everybody. I'm Ed Brown, and this is the 15th of September in 2018. And the subject of this little discussion is baseball in Beverly. Now, baseball, I have to say, is far and away my favorite sport. Others don't agree, but I love baseball. But before we get into the local connections, it's probably a good idea to go back a little bit and spend a couple of minutes talking about the history of baseball. Now, games played with stick and ball can be traced back to the 1700s. In fact, there was a children's primer book that was published in England in 1744 and then reprinted in the United States under the title of B is for Baseball. The ball once struck off, away flies the boy to the next destined post and then home with joy. I guess we can recognize it. The post refers to is that in the early days, bases were marked by wooden stakes driven into the ground. And on the Lewis and Clark expedition, when they left St. Louis and went up the Missouri River and then on across the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. On the way back in the spring of 1806, they stopped for a while to visit their friends, the Nez Perce Indians, who had saved them when they stumbled starving out of the Bitterroot Mountains on the way heading west. And Meriwether Lewis recorded in his journal that the men spent part of the day teaching the Indians a new game called base. And there's a woodcut in existence that was made in 1834 showing boys playing a game with a bat and ball on the Boston Common. These games were known by different names, and the rules they varied really from place to place. But baseball as we know it, now I don't want to hear anything about Abner Doubleday. I mean, that myth has gone on far too long, and there's no truth to it. Even today on the Red Sox radio broadcast, every now and then something unusual happens, and Joe Castiglione will say, "Old Abner has done it again." But that myth came about in 1907. The commissioners of baseball, who at that time consisted of the president of the American League, the president of the National League, and a third commissioner who was agreed upon by the two of them. There had been a lot of discussion about baseball really not being an American game. It was just an American adaptation of the Old English game of rounders. So they appointed this Mills Commission to look into the matter and come up with some proof that baseball really is an American game. Well, along came an old man named Abner Graves, who told them a rather meandering story. He claimed that when he was a boy in Cooperstown, New York in 1839, his friend Abner Doubleday improved town ball by drawing up a whole new set of rules, which were used for the first time when two local schools played each other. Well, the Mills Commission jumped all over this. That's just what they wanted to hear. Here's an American Civil War general who actually invented the game. So they just swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. If they bothered to do some checking, they would have realized the story was ridiculous, because in 1839, Abner Graves was nowhere near Cooperstown, New York. He was a cadet at West Point. And Abner Doubleday, there's no evidence that he ever played a baseball game or even saw a baseball game. That in later years, when the game had become wildly popular in the United States during his lifetime, he never wrote anything about it or claimed any connection with it. And when he died in 1892, I believe it was, his obituary didn't mention baseball. So they just jumped on this story and turned in the report that baseball had been invented by Abner Doubleday in 1839 in Cooperstown, New York. And so when the Baseball Hall of Fame was dedicated in 1939 on the supposed anniversary, I mean, where did they put it? Cooperstown, of course. That baseball was a small town invention. This is where it came out of. Now, where does the truth lie? Small town America? No. It actually came out of, I hate to say it, but it's true, the home of Mickey Mantle and Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth and Yogi Berra and Bucky Bleeping Dent, New York City. And it can positively be traced to the year 1845. And a man primarily responsible, his name was Alexander Joy Cartwright. He was born in 1820, and he was an athletic young man. He was a clerk in one of the New York banks, a cashier, I believe, and he also was a member of one of the companies that fought fires in New York City back in the early 1840s. And he and some of his friends liked to keep in shape by playing ball on Murray Hill. And they were using some sort of, the old town ball rules. But Cartwright decided that this could be very well improved upon. So in the spring of 1845, he showed up with a diagram and a set of rules in hand that he'd worked on. And he decided that the field should be 4 bases, 30 paces, or 90 feet apart. And that anything hit outside the lines of that field would be a foul ball. Before that, anything that was hit in any direction was fair. And he decided that there would be 9 players on a side, there would be 3 outfielders, and 1 infielder at each station near each base. And to balance off the infield, there'd be a 4th infielder who he called the shortstop. And there would be a thrower who would stand 45 feet from the home base or home plate to throw the ball to the batter. And of course, they'd have to be somebody stationed behind the plate to catch the missed pitches or the wide pitches. And these 9 players would bat in a prescribed order throughout the game. That before that, everybody batted in every inning. And rather than having everybody bat in every inning, he proposed a rule saying 3 out, all out. So once 3 players were retired, then the teams would change sides. So they tried it out, and they liked it very much. So they decided, well, we're going to why don't we form a club? We'll call it the Knickerbocker Baseball Club. So they formed that officially in September of '45, and they rented a meeting room in Fijux's Hotel, and they also leased playing space across the Hudson in Jersey, in Hoboken, the Elysian Fields, which they would use for their playing area. So twice a week they would board the Berkeley Street ferry and ride over the Hudson to Hoboken and choose up sides and play ball. And they also picked what they called first nine, their better players, who they could use to play against other clubs. And so the first real baseball game under the new rules, the Knickerbocker-Cartwright rules, was played in June of 1846 at the Elysian Fields between the Knickerbockers and the New York Club, which was a team of cricket players who had decided to take up some baseball. And it was the first evidence of gamesmanship in baseball history, because the captain of the New York Club decided that since Cartwright was the Knickerbockers' best player, he'd take him out of the game. So he proposed, of course, once they had started playing these new rules, they needed an umpire. Under the old town ball rules, a runner was put out by hitting him with the ball. And it was said there was no need for an umpire, because when a boy got hit in the seat of his pants, he knew he was out and there was no argument. But now with this 90-foot field, they found that a ground ball that was cleanly fielded by a fielder and thrown to first base would get there just ahead of a fast batter. So it turned out that the 90 feet was perfect for men playing baseball, and women later in the 20th century. But the captain of the New York club said, I want Mr. Cartwright for the umpire, because he's the one who drew up the rules. Who's better qualified than him? Plus, we know he'll be impartial and he won't, play favorites. So by taking the Knickerbockers' best player out of the game, the New York club won by a score, I think it was something like 23-1. In those days, there was no set number of innings. The game ended when one side had scored 21 runs. And it was also another first that day that the Knickerbockers had made a rule that a fine would be assessed on any player who swore during the game. So Cartwright fined his friend Davis 6 cents for using foul language. But the game, that game drew a big crowd of interested spectators. And the game grew so rapidly in Manhattan and Brooklyn over the next few years that by the early 1950s, baseball teams were springing up all over. And it was really an exciting time. And of course, the gamblers were lurking in the wings. But big crowds were showing up for these match games. The Atlantics and the Putnams and the Eckfords and the Knickerbockers and 4 or 5 others. After the game, they would usually, both teams would sit down to a banquet. So it was really a fun time. And the game started to spread up the Hudson to Albany and Troy and south to Philly and even toward the west, except in the area around Boston, where the young sports stuck to what was called the Massachusetts game, which was a really crude version. It was played on sort of a U-shaped field And you could have anywhere from, I guess, from 11 to 14 players on a side. It was really a chaotic thing, but it was their game, and they didn't want any part of the New Yorkers. Until about 1856, a man named Saltzman, who had played on the New York Gothams, moved to Boston. And when he saw what was going on in and around Boston Common, he was disgusted. So he started teaching his friends the Knickerbocker rules. And the next year, a baseball club called the Tri-Mountains decided to play, they were going to play the New York rules, the new rules. Trouble was they couldn't find anybody to play, so they had to just play among themselves. Then the next year they discovered that a team in Portland, Maine was using the New York rules, so they arranged for them to come to Boston to play in the Boston Commons. So the Maine boys got on the train in Portland and came down, and hundreds, if not thousands, of people showed up for this thing, probably to jeer at this silly New York game. But once they saw how great it was, that was the beginning of the end of the Massachusetts game. Now, Cartwright was not around to see his game spread. The fact of the matter is, and nobody's going to believe this, but it's true, the man who invented modern baseball was the first fire chief of Honolulu, Hawaii. When the news of the 1849 gold rush in California reached New York, Alec Cartwright and his brother, at that time they had a stationery business, which they sold. They decided they're going to go out to California and get rich. So the brother went by boat, which at that time meant going all around the end of South America and up the Pacific that way. There was no Panama Canal. And Cartwright and some of his friends got themselves a covered wagon and started heading west across country. And he wrote in his journal that he'd taken with him his own bat and the original ball that they'd used on Murray Hill. And on rest stops along the way, when they stopped to fix the wagon or buy supplies or whatever, they would start to get him out and start teaching baseball to whoever wanted to learn. He wrote in his journal, he said it was hilarious to see mountain men and Indians playing the game. Well, Cartwright made it out to California, and he ended up in Lodi, which is next door to Stockton, which is the Mudville of Casey at the Bat fame. And back in 1969, John Fogerty put Lodi on the map with a song of that name. Oh Lord, stuck in Lodi again. But when they got there, the gold rush was over. It had taken them something like 6 months to get across the country. The gold rush was over. So they realized there was no money to be made and headed for San Francisco. Well, they didn't leave their heart there. Things weren't all that much better. And Cartwright's brother caught up with them there. His ship came in. So Cartwright decided, well, I'm not going to go back across country. I'm going to see what else we can do. He ended up getting on a ship going to Hawaii, which of course at that time was an independent kingdom, but had a lot of business dealings with the United States. So his brother wrote home from California about Alex Cartwright. He said, where do you think he's gone now? To the Sandwich Islands. So Cartwright fetched up in Hawaii. Meantime, he left his wife and 3 young children back in New York because he didn't want to haul them across the country. When he got to Hawaii, he made a friend very quickly of Queen Emma. And before long, Queen Emma had appointed him financial advisor to the royal family, which was not a bad job. And he opened up a ship chandlery business, so he sent money back to New York for his wife and children to join them, which they did. And in 1851, so the family was back together again. And so by that year, he's laying out baseball fields in Hawaii and teaching the game, to the islanders, while the good folks in Boston are still mired in the dark ages of the Massachusetts game. And another thing that Cartwright had noted when he got to Honolulu was that there was essentially no fire protection. So when a fire got started, half the street would burn. We got to do something about this. So we approached Queen Emma and said, it's time for a fire department in this town. So she said, fine, go ahead, send to California for whatever equipment you need, and I'll pay for it, and get some of our fine, strong young men and get a fire department trained and going, which he did, so that he became the first fire chief in Hawaii, in Honolulu, from 1850 to 1859. And he spent the rest of his life out there, and he died in 1892, a very wealthy man of 72, but forgotten in the United States. But when the Hall of Fame was opened in 1939, then the people of Hoboken said, hey, wait a minute. Credit's going to the wrong place. We were where it all began. So they put up a memorial marker and got some stories written for the papers and so forth about where baseball had really been born. Now, the first reference to baseball in Beverly that I've been able to find was in June of 1860. Beverly, by that time, had gotten its own weekly newspaper, the original Beverly Citizen. And in June of 1860, the Citizen reported the following. At a meeting held on Thursday evening, June 7, several young men of this town, a club was formed for the purpose of playing baseball under the name of Magnolia Baseball Club. And the following officers were chosen for the present season: President George H. Stickney, Vice President Hervey Lunt, Secretary Andrew Eaton, Jr., Treasurer Augustus Stevens. Then this is rather interesting. The club have adopted the Massachusetts method of playing the game and meet every evening at 6 o'clock on the Common. So even though the New York rules had been around for 2 years, the Beverly boys were still sticking to the old Massachusetts rules. Now, out of those officers, there's a little discrepancy with the middle initial, but the George Stickney, who was the president, may have been the man who became a physician in Beverly, and Hervey Lunt had a real estate business here for many years, and Augustus Stevens was the cashier of the Beverly National Bank. So those founders of the Magnolia Baseball Club, some of them went on to have a pretty good career, and some other baseball clubs formed that same year. There was the Alpine Club, the Free and Easy, and the Agile. Well, the paper didn't say, we expect that they all played those archaic Massachusetts rules. But the next year, that was the last summer of innocence before the Civil War broke out. And the Civil War really spread baseball around because the soldiers played games in the camps, and people from states that hadn't been exposed to it were and brought it home with them. And when the war was over, the Massachusetts game was a memory. Because by 1866, the Citizen, in June of that year, reported on a match game between the first nine of the Beverly Club of Beverly and the Monitor Baseball Club of Salem. That was played on the Salem Common. And the Citizen reproduced a box score, which they credited to the Salem Gazette, which showed that the game consisted of 27 outs per side, which meant 9-inning game. So we know that by 1866 that the New York rules had prevailed and would from then on. And baseball just grew from there. So kids played it and young men played it. And by the early 1900s, Beverly had a semi-pro club that played its games at Peabody's Field. Now, Peabody's Field was owned by Henry W. Peabody, who was the man who built Parramatta for his summer estate, where President Taft spent the last 2 years of his presidency after being evicted from what's now Lynch Park. And he owned this open space of 12 to 15 acres near the Montserrat Depot between Essex Street and Odell Avenue. And he allowed the town of the city of Beverly to put a baseball field there. It had a grandstand and obviously a fence around it. And the Beverly Semi-Pro Club, they charged 25 cents admission to games, which was an hour's pay for a working man back then. And they were really very popular. They weren't in any kind of a league, but they played wherever any games that their manager, Dick Madden, T. Richard Madden, could arrange. Madden lived on Wallace Street. His father worked for the Boston and Maine Railroad. But Madden worked for the Submarine Signal Company in Boston. And that was a company that invented sonar for marine navigation. And the Madden team has to be thoroughly tied in with the career of Stuffy McGinnis, who was the best major league first baseman who was not in the Hall of Fame and certainly deserved to be. The lifetime batting average of .307 and played 18 years, and he was probably the best defensive first baseman ever to play in the majors, even though he had a tiny glove about the size of a ping pong paddle, and he was only 5'8". But he had his start. Stuffy was born in Gloucester in 1890 in September and learned to play baseball with his older brothers and their neighborhood friends. And by the time he was 15, Stuffy was starring for Gloucester High School. And Dick Madden taken note of him and signed him up for the Beverly Semi-Pro Club for the 1907 season when Stuffy was just 16. And he got his nickname from when he would make a great play, which he was very fond of doing. The fans would holler, "That's the Stuff Kid." So pretty soon they started calling him Stuffy. And all his life he was Stuffy. And when he was named baseball coach at Harvard in 1949, when he got his players together, for their first meeting, and the boys were wondering, what should we call you? Should we call you Coach? Should we call you Mr. McGinnis? His answer was, just call me Stuffy. So Stuffy at 16 was really making a name for himself with the Beverly team. And there were some very interesting games played that year that he was involved in. There was a team from Wakefield which thought they were really first class. And so the manager of the Wakefield team issued a challenge to the Beverly team to play a best-of-7 series for what they would call the baseball championship of the state. Well, Madden was all for that. So they started playing, and by the fourth game, which was to be played in Wakefield, the interest was so high that Madden, possibly through his father, who was a railroad man, chartered a special train to take the Beverly fans to Wakefield. Not an easy thing to do because the two communities are on different rail lines. But back then there was a way to do it. There was because of the old Salem Tunnel, the bore was so low that many freight cars couldn't fit through it. So freight that was going north of Salem had to travel over what they call the high car line, which went off the Haverhill line at Wakefield Junction and then traveled through Linfield to West Peabody and then on to Northey Point and Salem. So I'm sure that this chartered train must have left Beverly Station with a crowd on board and gone off in Northey Point and gone over the high car line into Wakefield, where they could then turn the engine and be ready to come back when the game was over. Now, unfortunately, the Beverly Times the game was played on a Saturday. The Beverly Times for that Monday is missing from the roll of microfilm at the public library, so we don't know how many people went on this train trip. But the Citizen the following Saturday reported that the Wakefield team won. And after 6 games had been played, the two teams were tied 3-3. And I can find no evidence of the 7th game ever being played, whether they couldn't agree on a time or place, or whether what happened, we don't know. Maybe they just decided they were so evenly matched to call themselves co-champions. But they could find no evidence of the 7th game. But there were some other interesting games played that already a rivalry was developing between Beverly and Salem. So the Beverly and Salem teams arranged a best-of-3 series. And the first game was played over at the Bridge Street grounds in Salem. Then they moved it to Beverly. And at that time, there was no compunction about using what they call ringers. In big games, the managers of the team would import a player from out of town, especially a pitcher, to come in and other things. So this is one of the things that Madden did. But before the third and deciding game, a big scandal broke out with Madden at the middle of it. That the papers reported the merchants in the two towns had pitched in to have a $100 pot of money that was to go to the winning team. And the scandal broke out when it was charged that Madden actually owned the Salem team as well, so that meaning that the money was safe no matter who won. Madden had to put out a statement to the paper saying that any allegation that I have any interest in the Salem Club is a falsehood. And there was another game that was played that year that was on the 4th of July. when Madden arranged a game for the Beverly team to play the Cuban Giants. Now, the Cuban Giants, certainly they were not Cuban. They were black Americans who, of course, were not able to play organized ball. So they had their own barnstorming team, and Madden arranged for the Cuban Giants to come to Beverly to play on the 4th of July when they could get a huge crowd and get a lot of money, and the Cuban Giants would get their share, and whatever was left the Beverly Club would have. And the interesting thing is that the Beverly Club in 1907 was actually integrated. Beverly's second baseman was a black player named Matthews, who was a student at the Harvard Law School. But on the 4th of July, Matthews couldn't play. He was getting married that day, and that was considered just a barely acceptable excuse to miss a baseball game back in 1907. So Stuffy, who had been playing the outfield, was moved in to play second base that day. And the Cuban Giants had a third baseman named Satterfield. And twice during the game, he hit balls that were sure base hits, but Stuffy made sensational stops and threw him out at first base. Well, after the second time, Satterfield, after the umpire called him out, according to what the Times reporter on scene reported that day, that Satterfield turned to the Beverly stands and hollered, "That darn kid will be a great player when he grows big." I don't imagine Satterfield used the word darn, but that's what they had to print. So Satterfield was the prophet. It was the day that the prophet came to Beverly, and he prophesied that Stuffy would be a great player. And he was right. And by the next year, 1908, Stuffy was playing shortstop for the Beverly team on a regular basis. There was no more Wakefield series, but they'd found a new rivalry to stir up the fans' interest with a team from Rockport. And what they would do would be to schedule 2 games in one day. They would play the first game in the afternoon at Peabody's Field, and everybody would get on the train to Rockport and then play the evening game down there. In one game at Rockport, they actually took a turnstile attendance that had 1,599 spectators. So Madden's team was really big deal here in Beverly. But unfortunately, it didn't last. The 1908 season was cut short in the middle of August, and the Citizen reported why. It said that Dick Madden was leaving town. He was accompanying the president of the submarine signal company aboard the Lusitania to go to England, with the idea that perhaps they might sell the Royal Navy on adopting their sonar system. So the season ended, and the Citizen paid a tribute to Madden. I won't go into reading it, but he said that he had given the city excellent baseball over the years. As for Stuffy, he finished out the rest of the 1908 season playing professionally. He's 17 now, playing professionally with the Haverhill team in the old New England League. So he could make some money and get somewhat of a higher level of play. But another thing that happened in late July of 1908, the paper reported that Connie Mack, who was the president and manager of the Philadelphia Athletics, was signing Stuffy to a major league contract for the next season when he'd be 18. So Stuffy got to play some pro ball with the Haverhill team and finished up the season there. And then he must have had a very long winter, anxious winter, going away from home for the first time in March to go to Savannah, Georgia, to join the big league club, the Philadelphia Athletics, and their famous manager, Connie Mack, 18-year-old kid. Mack was quite impressed. He called Stuffy the best natural baseball player I ever saw. And of course, at the time, he had an outstanding major league team. And there was no such thing as a farm system back then. That if a major league team wanted to send a young player out for more seasoning, about the only way that they could do it would be to sell his contract to a minor league team with the proviso that if they needed him during the season, they could buy him back, and the next season that he would report back to the major league club. Well, Connie Mack did not want to send Stuffy out and have any minor league manager try to change around the way he was playing the game. So Connie decided to keep Stuffy. He had his choice between Stuffy and an outfielder from the Sticks named Joe Jackson, who would later be known as Shoeless Joe. And Mack didn't think that Joe was that bright, so he sent him out and kept Stuffy. Now, it must have been kind of hard for Stuffy. He only got into 19 games that year. He sat on the bench. He did get to play opening day because their shortstop, Jack Barry, was down with something or other and couldn't play that day. So Stuffy actually got to play opening day. But all through that first season in 1909, he only got into 19 games. But Stuffy obviously used his time very well by studying what it meant to be a Major League Baseball player, learning from his teammates, especially Harry Davis, Jasper Davis, who was the first baseman and Mack's coach. He was an old National Leaguer who had been with the Athletics since the American League started in 1901. But one of the things Stuffy did was study the opposing team, and he learned to steal their signs. Now, Connie Mack was not one for cheating in any way, but he figured that if somebody was smart enough to steal the other team's signals, that was just good baseball. So that was one of the things that Stuffy contributed that first season. Well, he went the next year. He went back, and of course the Athletics won the pennant in 1909, but Stuffy didn't get to play in the World Series. But now he come to his third year, 1911. Now he's 20, and he's anxious to play ball. But Mack has got, he has Frank Home Run Baker at third base and Jack Barry at shortstop. And who was his second baseman? I should know, but the name slips my mind at the moment. And of course, Jasper Davis at first, and he had 3 stars in the outfield. But come to spring training 1911, Harry Davis is now 38 years old, and his legs are giving out, and his batting eye is giving out, and he begins to realize he's not going to be able to make it through the season. So he suggests to Mack, why don't you try McGinnis at first base? Well, Mack's immediate answer was, well, he's too small. Stuffy's 5'8". And like most managers, Mack likes tall first basemen. Well, Davis's answer was, have you seen him jump? He said he will catch any high throw that any first baseman in this league will catch. Besides, you must realize, Connie, our infielders don't make many high throws. So after a while, Stuffy is installed at first base, and that's the beginning of Mac's $100,000 infield. So Stuffy had the age of 20, he's got himself a full-time position, and he takes full advantage of it. He was probably the only baseball player ever to steal first base. And this happened because of it happened in Boston at the Huntington Avenue grounds where the Red Sox played before they opened up Fenway Park in 1912. Well, in 1911, Stuffy's 20, and he's the first baseman for the Athletics. And the Athletics are playing in Boston. And Ban Johnson, who was the president of the American League, was getting upset. Ban Johnson believed that no 9-inning baseball game should ever take more than 2 hours to play. Can you imagine if Ban Johnson was around today? So he's looking at ways we got to speed the game up. And one thing he thought about was that between innings, pitcher was entitled to throw 7 warm-up pitches before play resumed. And Ban Johnson figured, well, this is a waste of time. The pitch is warmed up anyway. What does he need 7 warm-up pitches for? So he put in a new rule saying that the umpires that as soon as the first batter was ready to get into the batter's box, the game was to resume. So this game in Boston, the Red Sox were behind the Athletics 6-3 after 7 innings, and Stuffy's leading off the top of the 8th. So he decides he's going to give Ban Johnson's new rule a test. So as soon as the Red Sox made the last out in the bottom of the 7th, Stuffy rushes the dugout, grabs his bat, and runs to home plate and winks at the umpire, Mr. Evans. And Leo Carger, who was the Red Sox pitcher, goes out to the mound, and Les Nunemaker, who was the catcher, puts his mask on and gets behind the plate. And Carger goes into his motion to throw a warm-up pitch. Well, just as he goes into his motion, Stuffy jumps into the batter's box, swings at the soft toss, and whacks it out into the outfield, where the outfielders, the Red Sox players being behind, are kind of just discouraged, and they're sort of jogging out to their positions. Well, the ball goes between the left fielder and the center fielder, and they aren't paying any attention to it. They figure it's just a loose baseball. So Stuffy takes off. He's running the bases, first, the second. By the time he's around second, the Boston infielders are yelling to the outfielders, "Get the ball!" But Stuffy makes it home, looks at the umpire, and the umpire signals home run. Well, that did not go over too well with Patsy Donovan, who was the Red Sox manager. He comes charging out to Evans and saying, "How can it be a home run? My fielders weren't in position. I didn't hear you call play." But now Evans figures, that he's just following Ban Johnson's new rule. So he says, "Well, I called it a home run. I'm calling it a home run." Well, Patsy Donovan said, "Okay, I'm playing the game under protest." So they get the protest. That means that he and the umpire both have to write a letter to Ban Johnson explaining the situation. Well, when it gets to Ban Johnson's desk, now he's in a kind of a dilemma because he realizes maybe that the Red Sox were right, but if he rules in favor of the Red Sox, he's ruling against his own rule. Besides, it just made the score 7-3 instead of 6-3, so it didn't really affect the final score any. So it went down in the record books as a home run for Stuffy. So he actually stole all 4 bases. But Stuffy went on to have quite a career. After the 1917 season, Connie Mack had to break up his team, sell off his stars, and he traded Stuffy to the Red Sox, so he got there in time for the 1918 pennant-winning season with Babe Ruth. So Stuffy started out playing third base for the Red Sox because their third baseman had gone into the Army. A lot of the players in 1918 had gone into the military. So their Red Sox still had their first baseman, but they didn't have a third baseman, so Stuffy was asked to play third. But then by May, the first baseman had gone into the Army, so Stuffy goes back to first. And that was the year the World Series almost was not played, because the Secretary of War ruled that the season had to end by Labor Day. Otherwise, the players would be subject to what they call the work or fight order. I mean, either you went into the military or you worked in a facility that produced war materials. So it looked as though the World Series wouldn't happen. The Red Sox were in first place on Labor Day, and the Cubs in the National League. So the commissioners wrote to the Secretary of War and said, you know, hey, a lot of people, including soldiers, follow baseball, and they really want to see a World Series. You know, can't you waive your rule for to allow the World Series to be played? So he did. He said we'll allow the two pennant winners will have a 10-day waiver to play the World Series. So that was how it actually did get to be played. They played the first to cut down on the travel. They were playing the first 3 games in Chicago. Then they would take a special train called the Commissioner's Special back to Boston and finish the series at Fenway Park. Well, for some reason, instead of playing the games at the Cubs' home field, now Wrigley Field on the north side, they decided to play at the White Sox home field on the south side, which had a larger capacity. The trouble was the Cubs fans did not want to go down to the south side, and the White Sox fans could care less about seeing the Cubs. So the crowds were rather minuscule. And Babe Ruth pitched the first game for the Red Sox, and they won the shutout. And the Cubs won the second game, and then the Red Sox won the third game to go ahead 2-1. Now comes the train back to Boston. Well, they couldn't find Babe Ruth. After the third game, the Babe had taken off to one of his favorite bordellos in Chicago. But apparently he told Stuffy where he was going. Stuffy was allegedly his roommate. So when they couldn't find Ruth, then Stuffy led them to where he was, and by that time the Babe was 40 sheets to the wind. They managed to pour him aboard the train and get back to Boston. He pitched the fourth game and won it. But the fifth game almost didn't get played because the players went on strike. The Lords of Baseball had ruled that only the players would share in only the proceeds from the first 4 games. That was to prevent any possibility of collusion in extending the series so that the players would get a bigger cut. And since they also had ruled that year that the second, third, and fourth place teams would get a piece of the World Series action, the players figured that they were getting nothing. So they refused to take the field for the 5th game till Van Johnson, who was drinking at a hotel in Kenmore Square, went down and he got the Red Sox together and saying, oh, the people are all here and the soldiers are here and you've got to play. And so they finally agreed to play. The Cubs won, but then the Red Sox won the sixth game. They won the players got a very small payoff for the World Series that year. And Stuffy, after the 1921 season, he was traded to the Cleveland Indians. Stuffy, meanwhile, had gotten married, and he married a Manchester girl, and they bought a house in Manchester and were very happy there. But before the 22 season, Stuffy gets traded to Cleveland by Harry Frazee, the one who sold Babe Ruth to the Yankees so he could fund his new hit musical, No No Nanette. So Stuffy spent the 22 season in Cleveland, and the manager there was Tris Speaker, who'd been the Red Sox star center fielder. Stuffy got along with most everybody, but apparently he and Stuffy did not get along. So even though Stuffy had a great year in Cleveland in 22 and set a record that stood for almost a half century for most consecutive fielding chances at first base without an error, which is another reason he should be in the Hall of Fame. That nevertheless, after the season was over, the Indians gave him his release. Stuffy's 32, and now he's something that hardly ever existed back then, and that was a free agent. Because with the reserve clause in place, a player was tied to his team forever unless he was traded. The Indians could have traded Stuffy, but they didn't. They let him go. And the Cleveland Browns wanted him there because George Sisler, who was their first baseman, was having serious eye trouble, and they didn't know whether he'd be able to play the 23 season or not. So they needed something, as an insurance policy, so they offered Stuffy, but his wife Elsie wanted no part of St. Louis. So Stuffy instead signed with the Boston Braves. He came home for the National League Club and played the 23 and 24 seasons with the Braves. Played very well. The Braves were terrible. I mean, they were a last place team, and they weren't drawing hardly any fans. So after the 24 season, before the 25 season, the Braves told Stuffy that he was going to have to take a pay cut. Well, Stuffy wasn't going to have any part of that. He said, the way I played for you, I'm not going to take a pay cut. So when spring training started, Stuffy held out, stayed home in Manchester. Now the Braves finally decided they were going to release him, so they did, and he figured that was probably going to be the end of his career. But the Pittsburgh Pirates came calling before the season started, and they had a new first baseman who they'd gotten from the Cubs in a trade, but he had been a second baseman. He was just learning to play first. So they figured we need a backup first baseman. We need somebody who can teach this kid and play some for us too. So they offered Stuffy a contract for 25, and he accepted it and joined Pittsburgh. And they made it into the World Series that year against the Washington Senators. And the first 3 games, the kid played first base and Stuffy sat on the bench. John McGraw, who was the president of the Giants and the New York Giants, he hated the American League, and he stormed in after the 3rd game. He stormed into the Cleveland clubhouse. The Pittsburgh clubhouse, and said, "What are you doing playing that bum at first base when you got the first baseman in baseball sitting on your bench? Get Stuffy in there." So whether that did it or not, for the 4th game and the rest of the series, Stuffy played first base, and the Pirates came back from a 3-1 deficit and won the World Series in 7 games. Stuffy had his last hurrah in the World Series in 25. He stayed with Pittsburgh and 26, and then they released him, and the Philadelphia Phillies were looking for a manager, so he managed the team in 27. They were a horrible team. And after 1 year, he'd had enough, so he came home. And at that time, Salem had a franchise called the Witches in the New England League. So they hired Stuffy as player manager. He'd be the manager and part-time first baseman in 28. So he played. That was the only minor league ball that he played, other than his time with Haverhill back in '08. Then the Salem team folded after that year. And Stuffy ended up as a college coach. He was at Norwich University for a number of years. I contacted them to see what information they had on him, and they essentially had nothing. They even had the wrong first initial for him. And then he ended up coaching at Harvard from 49 to 55, all the time living in Manchester. But after 55, the Parkinson's disease was getting to him, and so he decided that he didn't have the physical strength to keep coaching anymore, so he gave it up and came home and spent his winters hanging out at Brown's Market in the back room, talking baseball with the boys. And 1 year, he even coached Manchester high school basketball. Joe Hyland, who was the coach, had come down with the mumps, which for an adult can be a very serious thing. So he was laid up for 2 months. So Stuffy coached the Manchester basketball team for, I believe it was the 45 season. So he had quite a career. But anyway, baseball in Beverly went on. The trouble was that 08 season would really be the last for Madden's team, and it was the last for Peabody's Field, because Henry Peabody wanted the city to buy it. He'd offered it to him at a fairly bargain price, I think $26,000 for the 15 acres. But all through 1908, the folks in City Hall, they dithered and dathered and debated, and the editor of the Beverly Times was all for the purchase. So naturally, the editor of the Weekly Citizen was against it. And then in December of '08, Henry Peabody died. And the successor trustee, by the next spring, was cutting 5 streets through the ballpark. So Beverly in 1909 was without a baseball field. The only ball field in town was Lovett's Field, which was in North Beverly, where Henry's Market is now. And that was the home of the Sunday School League. Now, the Sunday School League, it sounds very genteel, but it was not a children's league. It was a league for older teens and young men. The only requirement was that they had to be a member, an active member of the church that sponsored the team. I think 5 Beverly churches sponsored teams, and the 6th one was the Wenham Church. Now, it all sounds very genteel, the Sunday School League. They charged 10 cents admission, and apparently the league was rife with rhubarbs and fights. It finally got so bad that the league's directors had to bring in a hard-fisted new umpire to restore order. So when a player got in the umpire's face, the umpire's fist would get in the player's face, and that ended the argument. So things calmed down a bit. But that was all the baseball, pretty much, that there was in Beverly in 1909 and 10. Even the high school didn't have a team in '09 because they had no place to play. Till finally, they developed what's now Cooney Field on the grounds of the Poor Farm. And so by 1911, Beverly had a ball field again, and they had actual teams again. And in 1919, there was a famous game that was played at Cooney Field, featuring Babe Ruth. Now back then, a number of players, and especially Babe Ruth, liked to make money in the off season by forming these pickup teams that would go around and play and charge admission and make some extra money, because the salaries back then weren't, of course, all that great. So Babe Ruth had formed a team in 1919, which he called the Red Sox Independents. The fact of the matter was that they didn't, have as much trademark protection back then, so he just appropriated the name with the Red Sox Independents, and he played, and he got Stuffy to play, and a guy named Sheehan, who'd also played on Madden's team, and several other big league ball players. So they came to the Beverly Athletic Field in October of 1919. And the Beverly team had broken up by that time, of course, with players had gone back to college or whatever. So they got a team from Marblehead to come over and play the Red Sox Independents. Of course, all of about 1,500 people, the paper said, showed up, all anxious to see if the Babe could hit a home run. And Babe hit his home run, so the people got what they came to see, and the reporter who covered the game said that Stuffy McGinnis, who's no stranger to Beverly fans, did good hitting. And of course, it wasn't more than a month or two later when Harry Frazee sold Babe Ruth to the Yankees. So that was his last time the local fans got to see him play in a local uniform. And throughout the 20s and 30s and 40s, Beverly had baseball teams. In the late 40s, there was a junior team called the Stars, which did very well. And in the 1960s, Dick Bresnahan managed the Beverly Recs, and that's R-E-C-S, not W-R-E-C-K, because they had sponsorship from the Beverly Recreation Department, and they played in the North Shore League and played at Cooney Field. And also, Beverly has another distinction as being the birthplace of Little League Baseball in Massachusetts. Now, Little League got its start in 1939 in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, when a man named Carl Stotts had found his two nephews moping about because they had tried to organize a pickup game on the local playground with their friends and were chased off the field by older boys. So he came up with the idea of a league for boys 12 and under. They'd have uniforms, and he decided on a 60-foot field, 2/3 regulation size, and some other rule differences. So that first year in Williamsport, there were 3 teams and 33 players. And I guess they added a 4th team the next year, and then a second league started. And they kept things going during World War II in Williamsport. And after the war, the idea began to spread. And one of the national magazines, I believe it was Look magazine, did a feature article on Little League, and so the idea began to take notice. And it started in Beverly, actually, with the United Shoe Machinery Corporation, which was then, of course, Beverly's largest employer. And the shoe had a branch office in Stamford, Connecticut. And by 1949, several Connecticut towns had taken up Little League. They had received charters from Carl Stotz, who by 1950 had copyrighted the program and given it trademark protection. So that you have to have to call yourself a Little League, you needed a charter. Well, in the summer of '49, a carload of men from this area went to Stamford to see what it was all about. And they came back, and during the fall of '49, several informal meetings were held, and by that winter, they were ready to go public. So in February of '50, they called a meeting in the Chamber of Commerce office on Cabot Street. And Carl Stotz had formed a deal with the United States Rubber Company, which is now Uniroyal, to underwrite setting up an office for the program in Williamsport and having some full-time staff. And they also had a couple of people who were going around showing what they call Little League movies to places that were interested. So 2 people came to Beverly on that February night and showed the Little League movies. And about 20 men were there, and they decided, hey, I think we can pull this off in Beverly. So they decided that they're going to form a 4-team league in 1950 and apply to Williamsport for a charter. And so they organized and appointed officers. Joe Nixon, who was the president of the Cornick Sporting Goods store on Cabot Street, was the only local sporting outlet. He was the first president, and they formed a Ways and Means Committee and other things. And so they wanted a field that they could be able to put a Little League-sized diamond where they wouldn't have to share it with anybody. And the mayor that year was Robert J. Rafferty, and the Public Works Commissioner came up with the idea of Bessie Baker Park, which had been bought by the city with money left by Bessie Allen Baker, who was certainly one of the great civic leaders of the town in the 1920s and 30s. And she left $5,000 for that purpose. And so they bought this park on between Cabot Street and Odell Avenue behind. With no stores there then, they soon went in. But according to the 1944 city reports, the park was not used at all. It was just there. So the city officials decided to offer it, as a possible place for the Little League. So Joe Nixon and Lou Apolloni, who was the manager of the Red Sox the first year, went down there with a tape measure. Lou told me about this in later years, and they measured it off and decided there was just enough room to site a Little League field. So the Board of Aldermen, which is what the city council was then called, approved the use of the park and appropriated $500 to build a field in there. So the Beverly Times printed an application form because they had no idea what they were going to get, and they were very surprised when almost 200 boys returned the forms. So they had tryouts, what they called practice, down at Cooney Field. And the four managers whittled it down to 4 teams, uniform teams of 12 players each. They got uniforms and et cetera, and equipment was designed for the kids that size. And so they had their 4 teams, and in order to ease the hurt for kids who didn't make it, they decided they were going to have 6 farm teams. 2 would be stationed downtown, and 2 in Ryleside, and 2 in North Beverly. So the field went in with a snow fence the first year. The second year they built a permanent fence, a high fence to protect the houses on Odell Avenue. The kids called the Monster. But the first Little League game in Massachusetts was played on June 11th, 1950. It was a doubleheader with all 4 teams involved. So that drew a lot of major attention from the local press. Anyway, the league got started, and people from out of town were coming to see these games, so that the next year in 1951, that Little Leagues were started in Danvers and Peabody and Salem and Lynn and some other places. So for the first time, they had a 4-team state tournament in Beverly. In 1950, there was only one other chartered league in Massachusetts. It was in Pittsfield. And so at the end of the season, Beverly picked an all-star team to drive out to Pittsfield to play the Pittsfield team for the state championship. And the winner would play, I guess, the Connecticut team, whatever, and you'd only need 3 wins to be able to go to Williamsport for the World Series back then, because there were so few teams. So there was no Mass Pike. They had to go, Route 9 and Route 20 all the way out to Pittsfield. And they got the first game. The second game was to be between the Rhode Island and New Hampshire teams. And the New Hampshire WMUR TV and Channel 9 in Manchester was going to televise the second game. So they had to start on time at 6 o'clock. So the Beverly-Pittsfield game ended up tied after 6 innings. And they wouldn't let them play extra innings because with the television commitment, they had to start the second game on time. So the Beverly team had to stay. The Pittsfield kids, of course, went home in their own beds, and the Beverly kids had to stay in a motel somewhere, which they apparently didn't get much sleep, as you can imagine. So the next day they had to go back out, and they expected to finish the game. But the tournament director ruled that instead of finishing the game, they had to start all over again with the first inning. Because Beverly thought they had won the day before. They thought they had scored the winning run in the bottom in the 6th inning. But the umpire, who was a Pittsfield man, of course, he ruled interference on the on the runner. So they called him out, which I guess must have accorded a big argument. But Beverly kids, because they were exhausted the next day and they got beaten badly, so they came home feeling that they'd been robbed. But anyway, the next year, Beverly hosted the state tournament, and they hoped to be in it, but they got knocked out in the first round by Danvers. But Little League grew in Beverly eventually from the original league to 3 leagues, American, National, and Federal. And then it was reorganized in 1984 back to 2 that they called East and West. And for a long time, Bessie Baker Park was their primary field, along with Vittori Park in North Beverly. But they've by the 80s, they really wanted a home field that they could be proud of to host tournaments and so forth. And there were 3 or 4 years which was spent looking all over for a suitable site. And for one reason or another, all of them were rejected. Till finally, in 1993, the city allowed them to take a long-term lease on the old, what they call the old Centerville playground by the 128 exit ramp, and build a home field complex there. So they went out, raised some money and borrowed some more money, and Harry Ball Field took shape. And it was opened fully in 1994. Of course, nobody playing now or any of the parents can remember when it wasn't there. They forget that the city built it when it actually was done by, was a lot of volunteer effort and a lot of local tradesmen gave their time and effort. And lights were installed, and a clubhouse with refreshment stand and toilets. And got a paved parking lot eventually, so that it's really quite a showplace. But it all started back in 1950 with a handful of men with an idea. And baseball continues to be, an important high school sport, and we have the Legion team and 2 or 3 adult teams that are playing in various leagues. So the game endures. I guess I've probably talked enough.